Hi, Pooven, and thank you for joining us again to talk about this important work. I'm really looking forward to having you tell us about the agreement that was recently reached. But I was wondering if if I could ask you to give us a short overview of the work of natural justice first.
Thanks, Killian, and thanks for allowing me to be in the space and inviting me into the space. So natural justice is just over 10 years old now, essentially working with Indigenous and local communities, in around 12 countries in Africa. We're mainly lawyers that are working on human rights and the environment and the kind of nexus between the two. But we've also played key roles at the African Union level, but also the global level in terms of global negotiations as well. So we're very much connected and work with communities, but also link up globally as well.
Great. Thank you very much for sharing all of that. And so one of the main topics you've been focusing on is the struggle between the San and Khoi communities and the Rooibos industry in South Africa. And could you tell us briefly how natural justice came to be involved in brokering this agreement?
Yeah, and maybe I'll just start with a bit of history and background very quickly. The Khoi and San people are the original people from southern Africa, and are known to be one of the oldest peoples around the world. Through colonization and apartheid, these communities have been brutalized. At one time in the 1600s, there was a sport to kill Khoi and San people. So it's a very brutal history, but also a history of land dispossession and forcing this community, who are largely hunters and gatherers, into small and confined spaces, which obviously shifted their way of life, but also their fundamental freedoms and dignity. So that's where people are coming from. In terms of this process itself, the reason why it's a big deal and very significant is because it starts to restore the dignity of the Khoi and San people, and recognize who they are as people and what they contribute. And as we think through where we are on the planet right now, I think we have a lot to learn from the Khoi and San, but also other indigenous people in terms of how we take care of the earth, how we relate to the earth, and so on. So this case, what it brings to the fore is the fact that finally there's some kind of acknowledgement around traditional knowledge, and specifically in this case in terms of Rooibos. So Rooibos is a massive multi-billion-dollar industry now. People all over the world are starting to know about Rooibos, and in terms of the tea. But these indigenous communities use Rooibos for many things in terms of medicinal purposes, anything from skin diseases to dandruff issues, but also in cleansing the organs, for example. So this knowledge was captured by a researcher, and at some point, companies got a hold of the research and then started this industry around Rooibos. But completely ignoring, the history of Rooibos and the people in terms of the Khoi and San people, that have orally passed through generation to generation, the knowledge about the plant and how they have been using it. So finally, this deal, A, speaks to recognition, but B, speaks to compensation and justice, as well. And in some ways, the global story and the national story come together because there's this convention on biological diversity that was signed, and then in 2010 there was this Nagoya Protocol signed in Japan, which basically focused on access and benefit sharing in terms of fairness and being equitable. And that provided the global framework in terms of genetic resources, especially that indigenous and local communities have been using and have the knowledge around. So based on that kind of global framework, in South Africa, we've been working with the San and Khoi people for many years around a range of struggles, and certainly, as the journey evolved, this issue of traditional knowledge around Rooibos was one of the central things.
Yeah, absolutely. And so when did natural justice start working with the San and Khoi people? Was it after sort of all those protocols were set up, you realized, okay, we can use this to work with them in order to have that claim to traditional knowledge, and now we have a legal framework that we can rely on, or?
Yeah, no, that's kind of how it unfolded. Because on the one hand, we had relationships, and we're spending time with Khoi and San people around a range of struggles, including the struggle on land and other issues. At the same time, we were, part of the global negotiations around the Nagoya Protocol, and those two things started coming together. And then, we linked up with the Department of Environmental Affairs in South Africa to see how do we implement this, international protocol within the South African context and based on South African law as well. And the key one here is the Environmental Management Act.
And so I'm wondering, with the Nagoya Protocol and the declarations that were so significant, obviously, for the San and Khoi community, and it sort of helped you reach this agreement, but I'm wondering what you feel is the significance of this agreement now for South Africa and the Khoi community in particular, but also how significant it is for Indigenous populations around the world. Do you feel like it's a standard bearer now, or it can become that? And also, how you would speak to the involvement of the Ministry of Environmental Affairs and the government of South Africa, how that sort of changes the game in a sense?
Yeah, no, it's been, a long and hard journey. I mean, I don't want to create the impression that, this deal just came about and it was signed. It was a really hard journey. The Department of Environmental Affairs played a key role, in terms of looking at, companies need permits to trade with Rooibos. So they get applications, which was really good for us and for the communities, in the sense that, okay, there's some mechanism, and therefore, that in some ways pushes people to come to the table. But also, I think there was a realization by the Rooibos industry that, there's certainly, the link between the Khoi and San and Rooibos, and, acknowledging traditional knowledge is the right thing to do. It's the ethical, it's a moral thing. But yeah, it's also a matter of justice as well. So I think with these different players coming to the table, there were many disputes, especially at the beginning, many key areas of contention, that played out. But I think every party was dedicated to making this work. At times, there were some meetings where, you think it's just going to fall apart. But certainly, there was that commitment. And I think one of the key things was a study done by the Department of Environmental Affairs, which essentially showed the link in terms of that traditional knowledge and the Khoi and San people, which was a fundamental, kind of building block. The significance of this agreement is it's the first of its kind globally. In the past, there have been specific agreements signed with individual companies. But this is a industry-wide agreement. So this agreement is with the whole Rooibos industry, which sets a massive precedent globally. And I think for Indigenous communities across Africa, but also in terms of other countries around the world, I think this is certainly going to be used as an example of how you can negotiate, an agreement like this, because it doesn't mean every time you have to go to court to sue a company or an industry. I think like the negotiated settlement in South Africa was a massive deal for us. I think this Rooibos agreement is a massive thing.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that when I look at this topic and the conversations we've had previously, it really struck me that you have this agreement that becomes a legal framework, and you have this document that people can rely on, and it speaks to then the importance having this idea of the rule of law, where you have these documents, these laws that are installed, and then people can use those to increase access to justice for their communities and for their populations. And really, congratulations and for this long and difficult journey. And I'm so glad that you were able to join us at the World Justice Forum to share this experience with us. And I'm just wondering also what you feel was your experience at the forum in sharing this with other organizations and people you met, and your interaction with other leaders in the human rights field. Do you feel like this is something that is happening across the world, and the work that people are doing, and how has being here helped you in advancing your own work as well?
Yeah, I think just before going to that, just to say, yeah, I think, key people, as I mentioned, within this negotiating table, and just to mention, from natural justice, Leslie Jansen has been our lead in the negotiations, but Roger Chennels is a well-respected human rights lawyer as well. So they played a massive role, together with the communities, and the communities themselves were the lead, in around the negotiating table. So we were there, to provide the backup and so on. It's been amazing being at the forum, just bumping into some people, that I know and have worked with. We're having a fascinating discussion the other day with someone who was on the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, just chatting about, back during the apartheid days and assassins and, so on, which was fascinating. But also, seeing people like Tuli Madonsela and others. But really, for me, the significance is connecting the different struggles, being inspired by the many people here that are involved in different struggles, but also the solidarity element for me is absolutely essential. So, beyond being inspired and energized, I think finding very strategic ways of connecting is absolutely, crucial, because there's so many different struggles going on, but many of these struggles are connected, based on, whatever area of focus or work you're looking at.
Yeah, absolutely. No, that's that's great to know that, and I think that's what we're looking for here, is for people to connect, communicate, and sort of bring that movement forward, and know that there are people out there that are working on this, and there's things to learn. And I imagine sometimes in this kind of work you can get discouraged, if you don't arrive at something. And I think what disagreement shows is that it's a long and arduous process, but you can get there, and when you do get there, it's extremely significant.
Yeah, I think, there's certainly, a lot of doom and gloom, especially with the current, kind of planetary crisis. But I do think there are many examples that give us hope. I mean, this agreement is certainly one of them. But there's many communities, that are winning little battles across the continent, but globally as well. And I think it's that kind of momentum that's going to help us, to deal with the kind of current situation we're in.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think what I wanted to ask you next is connected. I'm wondering what's next for natural justice, and I know you're working on multiple fronts, but maybe what projects are you focusing on right now? I know we talked about the Lamu issue in Kenya.
Yeah.
Maybe we could talk about that a little bit and see what your work is focusing on there.
Yeah, so as I mentioned, our work is very much community-based and largely with Indigenous and local communities. So Lamu is a good example of us, working with the communities there for the last 10 years, developing a community protocol to look at what the community vision is, what resources the community has, how it wants to engage with other stakeholders, and so on. But out of that process emerged, a range of key things. So Lamu is a World Heritage Site, a really beautiful area that's being devastated at the moment by massive infrastructure projects, a 32-berth port, a proposed coal mine, oil and gas, massive highways, and so on, essentially as an extractive model to take the resources out of Kenya. But this community is in the middle, of all of that. So, massive lease agreements being signed, where farmers don't even know that the land is being given away. The fisher folk, their livelihoods are being destroyed. So part of it is, legal empowerment and working with communities around their rights. Sometimes it means going to court. So at the moment we're in court around the trying to stop the coal plant, but also, won a case last year around compensation for local communities based on the damage and loss that they would suffer. So we'll continue to, work on cases like that. What's happening, currently in Africa is massive infrastructure projects across the continent. A lot of mining kind of projects, a lot of energy projects where communities aren't being consulted, and which obviously will have implications in terms of people being kicked out of the forest or the lands they're working on. So we will continue to work with a range of communities. I think the other aspect is obviously around climate change, which is, if you look at Mozambique, I mean, one city has been, 90% of the city is gone because of one cyclone, and I think, things are going to unfortunately get worse. But I think, working with communities, again, ensuring people are taking responsibility. So we'll be doing some climate litigation work, for example, but also really working with communities to look at, what are some of the alternatives? Because, we have to face the reality, of the situation we find ourselves in. So while on the one hand trying to hold those responsible to account, at the same time it's about being realistic. And looking at what alternatives there are for communities, and we'll focus, a lot on that as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there were a couple of strategies that you mentioned in our conversation previously about how you sort of attack the fact that you have climate change that's happening, obviously, but you also have all these companies that are coming in, and they're all different companies doing different projects, but in the same country affecting one community, and then how you go about sort of combining those efforts to solve three problems at once. And I know you shared the fact that you're able to work with development banks in Africa that have invested in those projects and putting pressure on them to hold them accountable, which might help solve some of that issue. But I'm wondering if there's maybe one or two other strategies that you would like to highlight that are truly effective in addressing those kinds of issues.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I think the most important strategy is what communities do, right, as communities. And I think in many cases across the continent, where communities have, stood up for their rights, it's led to something. Sometimes, in their favor, other times you have many activists that have been killed as well. So, it's obviously very difficult, but it's really where communities have stood up for themselves that there's some difference. And I think, us as organizations, we need to stand behind those communities. Yeah. In times of trouble, you have many NGOs that, suddenly disappear or leave, or, because the heat is on. And I think it's really important just to stand behind them. Certainly people knowing their rights, in some cases using litigation. But I also think, like in the Rooibos case, it is about multi-stakeholder engagement. It is about, connecting with people that have power and influence. So in terms of the development bank, the fact that they are funding, some of these projects means we need to be engaging with them. We need to highlight to them, what some of the violations that are going on. We're at a time where, we can't just be on the streets. We need to do that, and that's a central part of struggles around the world. But it's how we use, all of the strategies together. And I think in most cases that I've seen, from the struggle against apartheid to, many struggles around the world, it's been global solidarity, really, where there's a spotlight on a community, on an issue and a struggle that's led to some change. Because once the world is watching, people are really more wary of what they do and how they do things, because everyone's watching. And I think with this day and age, in terms of technology, we need to use technology to our advantage, within these struggles. But also, I think what gives me hope is, you have a new generation of young people that are starting to take the lead and really, pushing the boundaries, which is incredible to watch.
Absolutely, and we hope they'll be inspired by your work in the future and they'll be able to reproduce the same results. Thank you so much for joining us today. It's been so good to talk to you.
You too.
And we hope you'll make it back to the World Justice Forum in our next edition.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks so much.